senior management positions in marketing, sales, and general management in a series of countries. From 2011 to 2013, he was in charge of coffee and Milo in Nestle Oceania. From there, he went on to CEO of Nestle Central and West Africa region. He took over Nestle Philippines, a leading Nestle market worldwide, and one of the country's top corporations in 2018. With that, I turn over to Kais Marzuki. Kais.
Thank you, Coco. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session. Also, thank you for giving me the privilege to open the session. I feel it's a bit like the 5-minute advertising window before we get to the main program with our guest speaker today. So let me just do my spiel. So I think we're all here because I think we all care about sustainability and we see the importance of it. And that's why I'm sure that you will agree with me that the global threat that climate change poses to society and the planet is a challenge that we cannot ignore, we cannot continue to ignore, and we have to tackle it with urgency here and now. And for us here at Nestle, as the world's largest food and beverage company, we believe that with our global presence and our extensive supply chains, we can and we must face climate change as a top priority if we are to continue to thrive and succeed in the future. And I'm sure that in all your roles, in all your corporations, you have a similar outlook. Because we view the pursuit of desired environmental, social, and governance impacts in a way that will enable our business to grow and to gain eventually a competitive edge. It's no longer a nice to do, it is a must have. And as businesses increasingly confront sustainability concerns, our consumers are also becoming more and more conscious of how companies practice environmental stewardships and transparency. So consumers form brand preferences, we see it every day, and make their purchasing decisions accordingly. And therefore, the actions that the businesses take to foster sustainability can create a competitive advantage. And this is the essence of why we are pursuing sustainability in tackling climate change. As the head of the company here in the Philippines, I strongly believe that doing what is good for the planet means that we are doing what is good for consumers, for communities, for the whole of society, and for the earth itself. And at the end, I strongly believe that we are also doing what is good for our business. Globally, our company has taken a leadership role in tackling climate change, leveraging our scale and our reach as we strive to halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero no later than in 2050. Necessarily, tackling climate change entails significant investments, specifically on the onset that needs to be balanced against the bottom line. And I think this is something that is on top of our minds and we will discuss with our guest speaker later today. For our part at Nestle Philippines, we're engaged in 3 focused areas in tackling climate change, and I would like to take you quickly through them. First of all, we're transforming our operations. Since 2010, we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions in our factories by 40%, which is equivalent to greenhouse gases emitted by 23,000 cars in 1 year. We have also reduced water usage by 24% and energy usage by 38%. We started switching to clean energy in 2017, and now all our Luzon-based factories, as well as our Makati office, run on 100% renewable electricity. Last year, in 2021, we announced further commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And these included reducing virgin plastic consumption by 1/3, operating on 100% renewable electricity across the country, and further cutting 30% of greenhouse gases and emissions, all by 2025 in our local operations. Recently, the group has launched an initiative to plant 2.5 million bamboo clumps and 1 million native trees over the next 3 years in Mindanao as a carbon insetting effort, where this is where also our supply chain is found. Secondly, we are sourcing responsibly. We have a big program for many years called the Nescafe Plan, and through that, we are able to source responsibly grown coffee for Nescafe locally, working with farmers to improve their yields, incomes, and quality of life, and promoting the planting of more intercrops that lead to carbon removal in the atmosphere. The Nescafé plan teaches regenerative agriculture and sustainable coffee production to address climate change. We have a special focus program called Project Coffee Plus, where we are really working with 1,500 smallhold farmers in Mindanao and helping their transformation to agripreneur, and really focusing also there on reducing their carbon footprint. And it is in these coffee growing areas that we will be planting our 3.5 million trees. And last but not least, we are helping to shape a waste-free future. So in tackling the plastic waste crisis in the country, Nestlé Philippines is innovating and developing its packaging to make them all recyclable or reusable by 2025. We are the first FMCG to shift from plastic to paper straws in our locally manufactured ready-to-drink products. And as a long-term approach, we are collaborating with the public and the private sector partners to ensure that none of our packaging ends up in the environment. And these collaborative efforts have enabled us to achieve our most important environmental milestone yet, by becoming the country's first multinational FMCG company to attain plastic neutrality as of August 2020. This has been accomplished during the first year of the COVID pandemic, and since then, we have collected and diverted from the environment over 38 million kilograms of plastic waste, equivalent to the amount of plastic that we use in our packaging. And in addition to that, all of our factories have zero waste to landfill. On top of that, we are also advocating the passage of a law mandating that all producers and importers assume responsibility over post-consumer plastic waste within the framework of the Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, EPR. And I guess we'll talk about these kind of schemes a bit later. EPR is the environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility for product is extended to the post-consumption stage of the product's life cycle. And we are very glad that the EPR bill has just been passed in the House and in the Senate. In addition to these sustainability initiatives, Nestlé is now embarking on a further journey, which is beyond sustainability towards regeneration, to help protect, renew, and restore the environment, to improve and continue to improve the livelihood of our farmers and enhance the resilience and the well-being of our communities and our consumers. Regeneration, I think, is the next big frontier for us. There is a very interesting documentary on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, if you want to find out more, but I think it's really part of the whole carbon dioxide sequestration program, as CO2 emissions are put back into the soil and through that improve fertility and regenerate the soils. So I think lots of areas, I think, for us to explore and discuss together. But most importantly, we're looking forward to hearing from our keynote speaker to help us better understand and appreciate why it is important for all of us to be part of the action and how we can tackle the urgent issue of climate change. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for today's session. His name is Mark Smith. He's the Managing Director and Partner of the Boston Consulting Group in Singapore. Mark is part of BCG's Center for Action in Climate and Environment, and he leads the company's social impact practice in Southeast Asia. He's also a thought leader in this space, having published a multitude of articles on the topic, from circularity to carbon markets. Mark advises clients across industries, and in particular industrials, on climate and sustainability topics, from setting strategy, technology, as well as climate action plans. Prior to BCG, he gained significant experience in the chemicals and engineering industry as a project manager and engineer. Mark, we look forward to hearing your presentation. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kais. Thanks for the kind introduction. And hello to everyone. Thank you for joining this morning. I think the setup that Kais just made was perfect, because we basically heard around what are some of the outcomes if companies, in this case Nestlé, think about how business and sustainability can come together and create an advantage really for the company, right? So what I want to do now in sort of the next 10 minutes is just, I guess, first take a step back and on the context and how we are thinking about business and sustainability, together. Give a couple of more examples around what others are doing, and also the impact that is creating, both for the company, but also obviously for society and the environment. And then, close off with a couple of, thoughts around, how to get started or how to advance your agenda, that we can have a fruitful discussion afterwards. So let me start off by talking about the changing societal context. And when we talk about the societal context for business that is changing, we think about 8 areas in total. One is around escalating investor social activism. The second one is around the shared urgency to mitigate climate change impact. The third one is around the higher bars of rights to operate. 4 is around the transparency in ESG performance. 5 is around investors integrating ESG into their decisions. 6 around companies actually articulating a powerful purpose, and I think Kais just did that in his setup. The demand for good products doing good as the 7th one, and then on number 8, the collaboration for collective action. I just want to quickly highlight 3, which I think are particularly pertinent in the Philippine context. I think, the shared urgency to mitigate climate change impact is something that's very much, I think, top of mind, across society in the Philippines. You've had about 50 billion pesos in annual losses, due to natural disasters and adverse climate impact. You have about 20%, nearly 20% of the population, being exposed to sea level rise. And it's actually rising faster in the Philippines than it's rising in other places in the world by about 4 times. There's issues around food security, for example, as well. And the pristineness of seas like coral reefs, which is obviously a source of income for you from a tourism perspective, right? So that's one, for example, that's very pertinent. The other one actually, and Kais just mentioned ERP, but you also have the reporting requirements now in the Philippines as well, right? So there's pressure from a regulatory perspective sort of coming in as well. And then when we think about demand for good products doing good, actually the Philippine consumer in general, about 60%, choose products based on companies' value or social activity. So consumers do care in the Philippines. And the perception of sustainable products is actually quite high. Now, when it comes to price sensitivity of this, where we get to the business value, 70% of consumers would be willing to pay a small premium up to 5%, but only 10% of the consumers would be willing to pay a significant premium at this time. Now, this is obviously evolving, right? But if we take a snapshot of today, this is sort of the context that we're operating in. Now, if we look at what are we talking about when we think about sustainability, we actually think about all of the SDGs that need to be addressed, right? I don't want to go through them all one by one here, but I just wanted to make sure, we keep a wide aperture in terms of what are we trying to achieve by sustainable business models. Yes, it is about climate, it is about waste, but we can also think about education, gender equality, life on land, and so forth, right? So there's so the first question people or companies ask themselves is like, which one of these are we addressing? Where do we have the opportunity to create an impact, and what's obviously the business context for that? Now, when we talk about SDGs, typically we talk about they're perceived as challenges and constraints to our business, right? So we just move to the next slide. That rapidly changing context for us, I think, really from our perspective, requires companies to optimize both business and societal value. And when we talk about societal value, so it's the environmental and societal value as a whole, right? So again, the whole sort of set of SDGs. And we find typically, you see that on the left side, that companies think about all of these things as constraints. and actually restricting growth and value. We want to get companies to a mindset that these are opportunities, right? So growth and value is created by positively impacting environmental and societal needs. Right? So, and this often requires reimagining what you're doing, thinking differently about strategy and business models, where sustainability is then one of the outcomes that you strive for. And the way that we frame that on the next slide is really around moving away from what was maybe previously, a very business-centric sort of business outcome, total shareholder return, TSR focused view around competitive advantage, increasing shareholder value, business resilience, but thinking about what is the environmental benefits for stakeholders. We call that total societal impact, TSI, but you may call it ESG, and all of its components from economic vitality down to access and inclusion. And just to give you an example, of one in the Philippines, that has come to my attention is BPI. BPI actually has a strong sustainability and strategy framework for its responsible banking, making sure that their products and services integrate ESG criteria into business decisions. Now, I understand that maybe still part of at the beginning of their journey, but I think it's a good example. And if you look at sort of some of the sustainability reports that they've published, and maybe somebody from BPI is on the call today and can enlighten us later, but they clearly show that there's both the business performance, but also the impact, on some of the SDGs, for example, supporting micro entrepreneurs. They've supported renewable energy projects to the likes of 130 billion pesos. They're also not funding coal powered energy anymore. So it really shows like how one can bring these two worlds together into one. Now, let's say that's the theory, right? And maybe some good examples of what's going on. If you felt now, well, we're not quite there yet from what Mark just talked about, well, you're not alone. We conducted a study looking at 500 or so sustainability initiatives that companies were doing, across a sort of a broader cross set. And most of them were inefficient, right? So typical things were around, if I start on the right, not focused on value for external stakeholders, so quite internally focused. It was not embedded in the strategy and operations, so something basically running on the side. It wasn't a part of the DNA yet. It's not directly tied to P&L benefits. It was actually not led and executed by the business. So maybe, there was a foundation basically running it on the side, and not saying that's not good, but it's not what we're talking about when we're talking about sustainability in business here. Externalities of existing businesses were not fully addressed, and it was not well funded by the business in general, right? So 80% really of sustainability initiatives, which are all good initiatives, right? So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing that, because obviously doing good in general is good, but they were not actually linked to business value, right? And what we're really wanting to think about is how can we do this together and also create business value for ourselves while also doing good. So when we looked at the companies that are doing that, so 4 things sort of stuck out for us. So one was, most of the companies were really not maximizing sustainability as an advantage, right, as I just already mentioned. Only 1 in 3 were sort of really pushing the envelope. We found that typically there was not a clear structured approach. So, a lot of stuff happening, but not necessarily in a concerted way, which also would help create some quick wins going forward. Bold ambitions typically mattered. Those that set out to solve the root causes, and really dig down and trying to understand what's going on, they were typically able to more substantially transform their business. And if they were doing that, they typically found greater value, right? So if you're sort of doing small steps, you're not unlocking much value. Small steps are good, but when you think more transformationally, that's where the business value comes in, right? And you know, there's studies around, for example, that only 43% or so of Philippine companies really think about climate change and environmental damage, for example, in their risk assessment, right, that they do. So I think there's still a bit to go on around making this part of you know, the board agenda, basically. Now, to give you an example, and you know, Kais actually talked about what Nestle is doing, and Kais, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you didn't mention is actually that your coffee purchases locally increased by, I think, nearly 40% last year. And I think there's some linkages to what you've been doing on the Nescafé side that you mentioned there as well, right? So you know, just to complement what Kais was saying earlier about the initiatives that they're doing. So that's like one of the positive business impacts. Just another example from another part of the world, in Brazil, Natura, fourth largest cosmetic player, and you know, they really ramped up their R&D efforts to increasingly cater to consumer appetite for the environmentally, societally friendly products, right? So they did something, and you know, what we call own the origins. So I think similarly to what Kais talked about, is going to work with the local suppliers to source natural ingredients, right? So backward integrate to some extent into the supply chain. Then they obviously monetize this and sold these products at a premium. So you know, in the markets, obviously that would cater for that. But they also use this to re-energize the brand, right? The brand was failing a little bit, and they wanted to, through that sustainable spin, they really energized the brand, both in the market, but also within the company. And the advantage that it really created, that it fueled innovation, security of supply, so they had some supply disruptions which were helped through that, and it provided additional revenues. Now, and I'll step through this now quickly to wrap up, but I did want to address the point around, does this create value? Often it is not so easy to link back the business value of one sustainability initiative back to the P&L. But what we see holistically actually across the board is that we can measure the impact of sustainable business models as a whole. And so this is a CPG example where we're really seeing that EBITDA margin, you know, across the board has improved by 1 to 4% by doing, you know, a multitude of things. And we see a higher valuations in the market as well. So that's maybe just to leave you like on the point of the economic impact. So if let me wrap up maybe with the next slide, and because I know we're on time, so let me skip this one, and you know, happy to share this obviously with the audience after. But here are basically 7 things that you can think about doing to get started, right? And you know, don't do obviously more of what you're already doing, but there are basically some archetypes around what to do, and we could discuss a bit more in the conversation than, you know, what are examples of that. One is own the origins, so go back upstream. The next one is own the whole cycle. So this is about circular economy. So Kais talked about that, what Nestle is doing. You're really thinking about more broadly, what's my environmental societal footprint? So not just what's beyond the factory gate, what's happening upstream, what's happening downstream for me. Sort of relocalize, re-regionalize to benefit local communities and the countries that we operate in. And maybe for you more like the, you know, the provinces that you operate in. Expand the value chains. Build across sectors, meaning, you know, think about the intersections with public sector agencies, non-governmental agencies, and build something around that as a whole. And then, as I talked about, energize the brand. So using sustainable business models to re-energize the brand, the perception in the market with consumers, also in the B2B business. So I'll stop here to not take more time and hand it back to Kais first.
Mark and Kais, thanks very much. Before your chat, please allow me to remind our attendees that if they have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll get to them in the open discussion. We'd really love for your questions and for yourselves to be part of this conversation with Kais and Mark. With that, I'll turn it back to our two gentlemen today. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Coco. Thank you, Mark. Really very interesting presentation. I think you're really laying the landscape out very well. If we can just maybe start again from the beginning. My first question is, why we're now in the middle of a pandemic? You know, we all have 1,000 other worries to pull our businesses through these difficult times. We are using masks and throwing masks every day. You know, we're also consuming more plastic, I think, through the pandemic. Why should we now focus on sustainability? Why is it important to do this now, despite everything around us?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kais, and I guess maybe two-pronged answer to that. One is, you know, I guess if we frame it more as a broader, you know, societal and environmental context, there's obviously things that we need to address that are either coming out of the pandemic or inflicted by the pandemic that we can also build into our sustainable business models, right? So we shouldn't ignore the pandemic by all means, right? And obviously, you know, both from a safe and health perspective for companies, but also, you know, obviously how it has impacted societies as a whole. So there's a way also to build, I think, the points of the elements of the pandemic into this and how that has affected the SDGs, because, you know, as you all would know very well, I mean, we've been in some areas, and I think, let's say for example, from an education perspective in the Philippines, we likely have been thrown back a bit through the pandemic, right? And so how can we incorporate that into our thinking? And then secondly, I think it is really you know, for us, it's the new competitive dynamics, right? And the new competitive game. And by that, I mean, also, we're not just doing good, right, for the society, but we're also helping grow the business and create a stronger, more profitable business going forward, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? So, and so maybe, you know, in all the business priorities, one needs to think about the timing of this, like what you do when, but we think it's a good time to set yourself up basically for the future.
Yeah, I think we're also seeing that, you know, millennials or Generation Y and Z really maybe through this pandemic more than ever consider sustainability as a top concern. So I think we have to address this concern of our consumers or future consumers, despite, I think, the tensions and the pressures we have now. But coming back to these pressures, you know, one side, you know, we are faced with high inflation, so everybody has to take price increases. You said that in the Philippines, 70% of our consumers are ready to pay 5% more. But I think generally already we're taking probably 5% at least price increases because of all the input costs going up post this pandemic. So we cannot charge them for sustainability. And I think at the end, what consumers don't have in their pockets they can't spend. On the other hand, you're saying that, you know, sustainability has to be central to our strategy. So how can we, this is a big tension. And the return, as you said, is very difficult to measure immediately. It's more longer term probably. So from one side, we have this a lot of pressure not to do it. And then you're saying it has to be the key thing at the heart of everything, which is a long way. So does it mean as a business, then better I don't even try now because I have other worries? Or should I just do a little bit? Or how do I engage on this necessary but more long-term path while I have all these pressures in the short term?
Yeah. So I guess, you know, and I know, you know, this sounds easy in theory, it's harder in practice, right? But it's this question around what are real constraints that are put onto my business, and, you know, what are maybe opportunities in there. So for example, I mean, the part about backward integration, working with the suppliers, if in food with the growers, or maybe with other small scale suppliers in some of the other businesses, in consumer goods. Doing that, I don't think, doing that in a way that doesn't creates a win-win for both, right? So it doesn't necessarily load onto the cost side, or at least not, doesn't increase it to too much of an extent. And so it's a breaking sort of that contradiction sometimes that exists, right? I mean, and it's not easy. I mean, I'm not saying, just it would be an easy step. So I think that's one side. And then the second one, I think, is how to convert that obviously into maybe a premium. And I think if you think about that one, it's really understanding, I think, what is driving the consumer. So we haven't done this study in the Philippines. We recently did a study on this in Indonesia. And we were testing sort of how climate sustainability, how much top of mind basically it is across sort of the funnel from awareness to actual action. And that would actually, probably similar, I would expect, in the Philippines from a result around, yes, it's important and so forth. But then when you ask them to rank it across some of the other pressures, there was education, it can basically job security or income in particular, and then obviously also food, food security, that come up as well, right? So if you, like, from a perspective of positioning in the market, only talk about sustainability from an environmental perspective, but don't link it, it doesn't link back to the concerns of the consumer, then obviously it's very difficult to create a premium, right? But if you, for example, link back your actions with the growers, that you're actually helping them being more economically viable, that will resonate with the consumer as well. It may not help him or her at that point in time, right? And I mean, I think also at your initiative, guys, it's also about increasing the yield of farmers, right? And the yield increase is massive for a small holder farmer, right? Because everything that he basically creates, typically it doesn't require much more, or sometimes even less inputs, because, I don't know, fertilizer is not applied in the right way and so forth. And all the additional yield actually goes into his pocket, right? And then helps fund the education of his or her kids and so forth, right? So really understanding, I think, these dynamics is really critical, and then leveraging them, right, and making sure that they also are visible to, the businesses or the consumers you're targeting.
Yeah, I think maybe there are two sorts of initiatives. I think maybe we found in our experiences. You mentioned the coffee farmers. So we have this Coffee Plus project where we took 1,500 farmers and really accelerated their progress, and we managed in a couple of years to triple their yield. Okay, so which really has a significant impact on their income, and also to taught them intercropping, so they can also grow other vegetables around the coffee trees. So that I think has been very successful, but you can say it's part of our value chain. At the end, the more coffee, because you mentioned that we bought 40% more coffee in the Philippines last year. That's because it was a good crop year. We buy all the coffee we can find, and yet we still have to import more than 70% of the coffee we need. Right. Because there's simply not enough coffee. So I think you can say, yes, it's a good initiative from Nestlé to invest into developing farmers, but at the same time, you can say it's also a benefit in our value chain, because we want to buy as much as we can here. So that, I think you can see the link to business directly. But if I take another initiative like the plastic neutrality I mentioned, right? I mean, we went plastic neutral in 2020, which was really the worst year, the first year of the pandemic. And as I mentioned before, I mean, 38,000 tons of plastic have been diverted from landfill and put and disposed of in a clean way. But at the end, we paid, and this is not a secret, we're paying 5 pesos per kilo of plastic. Okay, so the investment is in the millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of pesos. Much more difficult to see, to justify from a P&L point of view, why are we doing this? what is the where's the return? And we had a lot of debates internally, honestly, as well, saying, okay, but why are we going to waste that money? I mean, then are we going to save the oceans? No. So why are we doing this? Are we going to get a return? Are consumers really going to choose our brands? Probably not in the immediate future. These are some decisions are much more difficult to take because the return or the link immediately to business result is not there.
And it's
how do we overcome that?
Yes. It's a longer, and sometimes these payback periods can be long, right? And there's uncertainty associated, obviously, with it as well. I mean, I don't want to sort of ignore that by any means, right? So, I mean, we talked more about the opportunity today than the threat, or the way I've phrased it. But obviously, when you think about plastic, when you think about CO2, I mean, there is a potential threat there to your P&L as well, right? So carbon taxes, when we think about CO2, now one can take a position, we don't know exactly when they're coming, to which extent, and so forth, right? But we've seen in a lot of countries that these changes typically come more quickly than they were expected, right? And so there's a risk exposure if you don't tackle it. Now you can think about how much you tackle it going forward, right? Same as for plastic. We've obviously seen regulation around banning certain types of plastics, maybe not necessarily straws, like in this part of the world, but obviously plastic bags. In April, there's a UN conference of the UN Environmental Agency where there will be a discussion on a plastic treaty, basically to ban certain plastic or certain practices, at least, around it. Now, that, granted, that's not going to happen then in 2023. That's a longer process, right? But there are, just as an example, those are also risks, business risks that you're facing, and those obviously need to be taken into account as well. And the last thing, I mean, Kai, just to your point, and I think I saw something in the chat on this as well. I mean, yes, I've admittedly been sort of talking a lot about premium, but there's also market share, right? And I guess, to your point just now, maybe it's not easy to convert this into market share. But you also need to potentially protect your market share if somebody else is able to do this, right? So it's also obviously a competitive dynamic question, and not just standalone what you do, right? In that sense.
Great, thanks, Mark. Maybe last question from my side, because we mentioned also EPR schemes and more industry-wide initiatives. Are there any examples you see in other countries in our region that we can get inspiration from to see how government or countries can shape the agenda of sustainability in a stronger way and get everybody on board?
So Southeast Asia, I would say, is not necessarily a beacon for environmental regulation in the world, right? So in pockets, yes, and we recently did sort of some regulatory assessment, and even in what you would call the most developed economy in this region, which I'm sitting in, there's still quite a ways to go when you think about waste and recycling and so forth. I mean, we still throw our batteries into the normal trash here, right? I mean, so unfortunately, there are, I would say, from a comprehensive perspective, I don't think it is. There are some good pockets of how to sort of, again, I think fostering business value or business creation, as well as environmental side. So for example, when we think about carbon markets and carbon offsets, Malaysia, for example, is fostering a Malaysian domestic carbon offset market to help sort of the development of projects and assets, but at the same time, obviously, without pushing sort of climate action within the domestic market. We were seeing some sort of similar type of activities in the other markets as well. But particularly, I think on the climate side, I think the conundrum for us here, and we're actually working in one of the economies with a couple of leading companies around forming a coalition around a just transition. because we realize that, you know, the concepts that we may have in Europe or in the US or so, you know, don't necessarily work here, right? We cannot just push emissions reduction while we don't take into account socioeconomic development, particularly obviously on the energy transition side, but also like the impact that it has to jobs creation, right? So in Indonesia, it's all about the mining sector, right? So what will happen to all of those people? You know, we can't just sort of put them on the street from one day to another, you know, and you know, in other countries, it's also about AFULU, so land use and land use change, and how, you know, if we want to change agricultural practices, how does that affect the income of individuals? So I think, you know, that for me is a bit of the gold standard around how governments in this region need to think about it. There's a lot of good pockets of thought, but, you know, I don't think it has fully come together yet.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for your insights and for motivating all of us to embark on this journey and making the case for sustainability. Thank you. Go over to you.
Yep, right back to you guys. Your conversation there about your plastic neutrality project, also very insightful and very inspiring. In fact, I'd want to keep on that just before I turn to the questions from the participants. You talked about how I think you said the question is, why are we going to spend this money if it's not going to necessarily be the tipping point of saving the oceans or something to that effect? Could you tell us? I'll ask Kais first, and I'll ask Mark for similar examples in other companies that they've helped. So you have this conversation, Kais, and I don't know if there's a conversation outside of Manila and they tell Manila to do it, or it's a conversation you're having here. What finally tips the decision that way? Because there's a good argument on both sides, right? So what finally tips it, I'm going to say, in the right way?
Honestly, I'm not too sure I know exactly what tipped it, because we were the first Nestle market to do this in the world. So there was no pressure from Switzerland. I think we were under pressure ourselves on the P&L, but I felt like we had to do something. And honestly, they now even made a case study at one of the business schools on exactly that decision point. You know, when do you take that decision and why do you do it at the end? So it was more like a gut feeling. Let's go for it and let's see what happens, because we have to do something. And I think we wanted to be really embarking on that journey. So, and I think we tried, and this resulted, I think, as a result of different projects we had, which resulted in failure. To be honest, I think that's why the test and learn, I think, is also very interesting, because we had the whole pilot in the city of Valenzuela, and we tried to find ways to retrieve the plastic. And we say, okay, we went to consumers and to schools, and we said, bring back your plastic from your home. We give you 8 pesos per kilo, bring it back, and then we'll dispose of it. And to be honest, it didn't work. Consumers were not motivated. It was too much hard work to collect the small pieces of plastic. After a while, it starts smelling badly in your kitchen. All of this for 8 pesos a kilo. So after a few months, you know, we realized that's not the way. Then we looked for other ways, and we ended up with this really easier and critical mass achieving way of going to the junkyards and collecting the plastic and bringing it to cement kilns, where it's really used as a combustible to create cement, and it's a clean process where the plastic totally disappears and there are no emissions in the atmosphere, which is also absolutely acknowledged and accepted in other parts of the world. So we tried in different ways, and then obviously we said, okay, we do it with the cement companies. Okay, this is the bill. Do we do it or we don't do it? And then we had said, okay, let's just do it, and really, honestly, we are not regretting it at all. And what surprised me also was not only the impact on the image of Nestle in the Philippines, but also the pride our employees took in this. So internally, it had a big motivation effect, a big booster. And everybody was very happy that the company was engaging on something new like that and being different from other companies, which honestly did not consider initially.
Thanks very much, guys. Mark, do you have stories of similar decision-making processes in other companies where, I guess like any company, or at least the 43% of companies or whatever percentage of companies think about climate, where they come to a decision point like this, and the decision tips in the right direction. What tips it in the right direction?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of two things here. Obviously, one is the sort of the opportunity, if I can call it this way, and the other one is the risk. And maybe I'll talk about the risk first, because that often is what is more business leaders obviously fear probably more than missing out a growth opportunity, because there may be others, right? And the risk is, there are some obviously clear risks, like on the legal side that I talked about, or regulatory side that I talked before. So, and sometimes they're not so imminent, so maybe you can kind of push it off a little bit. But there are obviously, some of companies, and this is more on the climate side again, and maybe a bit more on the industrials, so not so much on the consumer, but if you look at financing, ESG performance is becoming more important. Access, for some companies, it's pure access to financing. For others, it's thinking about, lower cost of financing. There's a lot of financing mechanisms in play around sustainability as well, right? So having access to that to fund the business, but obviously you need to also perform appropriately to do that, right? So there's a risk opportunity, I guess, in that. What also really resonates with me is what Kais just said about employees, right? So depending, we may, I guess sort of the generation of the 40, 50-year-olds may be thinking slightly differently about this, but the 20-year-olds, or they're just entering the workforce, they, if they have the choice, they would rather go to the company that has the better environmental footprint, that's seen to be more active, right? So it becomes a talent opportunity risk, depending on how you want to look at it as well. And then I think the last one is, and this goes back to the conversation earlier around, I guess, time. When is the right time to do it? And look, it's difficult to talk about this on a generic basis, right? Because every business has different competitive dynamics, and depending on how you set up. But there is a risk of being shut out in certain areas, right? So, for example, if somebody, if you're a food company and you want to integrate, or you're reliant on a certain set of smallholder farmers to support you with their goods, if somebody comes with a better proposition to them and basically takes away the access to those folks for you, you have an issue, right? You have the issue in your supply chain. We've had discussions around how to pick up on the plastic topic. Typically in Philippines still, and everywhere else in Southeast Asia, there's actually the infrastructure for recycling or circular economy is not there, right? And that, the effort that Kais just highlighted. And so, but if you think about recycling of plastic, for example, you need to actually have, recycling facilities that are able to process that, right? So, and so, for example, if somebody would set up a recycling facility, let's say on the brand side, together with a recycling company, and they basically take all the plastic from a certain area and then have primary access to recycle plastic, what are you going to do as a competitor, right? So you're shut out of that area, at least. So I mean, those are sort of, if you think about the long-term competitive dynamics of this, there's things you need to do today to make sure that you're still relevant going forward. Now, what's relevant going forward is then obviously the discussion that you need to all agree on as a management team to say, okay, so what world do we believe in? Basically, how quickly will this evolve? Is it sufficient that we'll be reactive when it comes around, or do we need to be proactive now? So difficult, Coco, I'm sorry, I probably didn't really answer the question in that sense, but I think those are sort of the conversations, and typically it's sort of like some of these like critical risks that are perceived that then push people over the line and say, you know, let's invest now. There is a business case. It's good enough. Let's go ahead with it.
Thanks very much. I liked all of that, particularly when you talked about, did you call it the talent opportunity risk? Was that your phrase?
Yeah, talent. Yeah, the talent opportunity or risk, basically. Yeah.
And the cutoff for that is what? What age? Be careful.
Well, I mean, so I'm obviously somebody who's passionate on this topic. So I'm also, you know, so I don't think it's necessarily demographic only, but obviously, I don't know, you know, 20 and early 30s. I think it's more prominent, basically. But I not only, right? Not only.
I'm going to turn to the questions now, but I'd like to ask all of the participants if you could just type your age in the chat box, and we'll see where we fall on that talent opportunity cost.
That's not even anonymous.
Well, I'm going to start. So there. First question. Thanks very much, gentlemen. First question goes to Lala Rimando of Esquire, and it talks about that 43% that you mentioned. Lala.
Hi. Okay, I'm not going to turn on my video, but I caught that statistic you mentioned, the study results on the 43%, and how Filipino companies are including climate change issues in their risk assessments. I did a similar study like 20 million years ago, and the number I got was hovering in the low teens. Like I don't remember it now, but around 11%, 12%. So I'm not sure if that jump from 11% to 43 is something I should celebrate or cry about, because it's already 2022 and we've gone through all of these, you know, big typhoons and earthquakes, etc. So is that number, is that the survey result something we should be proud about? We should be tapping ourselves already, like, okay, we are at it. And how do we compare with other countries? Not necessarily in Southeast Asia, but maybe other countries who are hit by similar climate change effects.
Yeah. It's a good question. So just full disclosure, this was not our study. This is somebody else's study. I'm happy to share the link as part of after the talk as well for you to further read up on. And look at the specific quote, I guess, if I can just make sure that, because it matches with what you're thinking of, is that only 43% of Philippine companies factor climate change and environmental risk damage in their strategic risk management activities, right? So that's basically the statement. Now, I think you can obviously take a glass half full, half empty approach when you on a 43%. You know, and if your number from a couple of years back was lower than that, then obviously it's going in the right direction, right? And the point here is, you know, this doesn't mean that 43% of the companies are, you know, what we would call sustainable business model innovation. So thinking about climate, environment, societal challenges and building that in. It just means they're consciously evaluating these and how these would impact their business, right? Now, I don't have the numbers top of mind, you know, and maybe we would need to look back at the study. I don't think necessarily this is such a bad number, right? But, you know, in a sense of, I would expect, yes, it should be higher. And yes, you know, large multinationals typically, for example, put more, you know, resources behind this. But, you know, if you would, you know, sample a broader set of companies, you know, I think the depth and the quality of looking at those risks is probably in a similar range, right? Maybe it's 50, maybe it's 60, but I'm sure there's also a lot of companies that sit a lot lower than that.
Right.
But these risks are real, right? I mean, like you talk about climate change, obviously for the Philippines, which we're all, acutely aware of, and in a way that we basically, let's call it, have too much water, right? And there's other places in the world where we don't have enough water, right? If you remember only 3 years ago in Cape Town, I mean, they basically ran out of water. I remember visiting at that time, and all the restrictions of water usage, right? We have the same in Chile, right? So there's like, belts that are actually right on the opposite, and these companies need to think about even being able to do business in a way. If you read the last UNFCCC report or CCC report, it started detailing the climate impact that they foresee in the next decade and in each specific geography. One thing to not we talk a lot about, storms and floods and so forth. One other thing to not underestimate is heat, right? We're already living in a hot part of the world. Just, a couple of one or so degree increase in our average temperature, which will likely have, meaning that we have more significant peaks, will impact the ability for people to work in factories, to work in the field, to work on construction sites, right? Because it's not a workable work environment anymore, or at least it poses significant HSE risks at that point in time, right? So I think, when we think about holistic sort of assessment of this, we need to really think broad around these impacts, not just the ones, that are top of mind, right? Because, they're like at our doorstep or something we see every day.
Thanks very much. I have a follow-up to that, but I want to check. Paulo Montero of Ayala, are you still here?
Hi, Coco. Yes, still here.
Hi. I know you have to leave at 11, so maybe
No worries.
time to insert your question here. Go ahead, Paulo.
Sure. Thanks, Coco. Yeah, Kais, Mark, thank you for your thoughts and insights. It's certainly relevant, especially for us as we're going through the sustainability journey. But I guess my question is all about, a lot of the companies, organizations in the Philippines may already have bought into the why, sustainability, but the how is often the difficult part. So with all of these commitments, achieving the SDGs by 2030, of course, Nestle's own commitment of net zero by 2050, where and how would be the best place to start? And I guess this is a struggle. How do we create those quick wins, those excellent quick wins, in order to build momentum towards more complex initiatives for the long term? And of course, there's always the consideration of balancing the sustainability aspect with a financial aspect as well. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that, on the where and the how to start.
Okay, happy to go first. So first, I think we need to recognize, as you say, not only that companies have recognized the why, but actually, typically, there's a lot of stuff already going on. And often what we find, we're working with our clients is good stock take, and depending on how big the company is, you have to cast your net quite wide to really understand what is going on, but then really thinking about what is the impact that is creating. So often there's, as I mentioned, sustainability initiatives, but it's not clear necessarily what the impact back to the company is, right? So one starting point typically is around stock take, where we're at. I guess secondly is then putting out a direction, right? So more of a strategy that then helps to, with the stock take, say, okay, what do we prioritize? What are quick wins, as you say, but also what is missing, right? So what do we need to work on going forward? But much of this then at that point in time, is actually, you can have a whole set of initiatives, and maybe that's good to kickstart. You can make it like special projects and so forth. But I guess if you want to push this to the level that we're as BCG are advocating to, if as best in class, and not everybody needs to be there, right? To be frank as well. I think it's then also how do you translate that into everyday activities in your organizational setup, right? So and much, often companies 5-10 years ago thought about how to bring digital in some form into their organizations, which also started more as digital analytics, somehow outside, do a couple of things. It's really permeated, pretty much everything that we do, right? And I think what we're advocating is like, while you need to have a strong sort of central, function of some sort, capabilities, right? Because the capabilities are typically quite specific. It's important that it's integrated in everything that you do as a business, also from a governance, for example, perspective. In the example I mentioned earlier with BPI, as far as I understand it, is that they, really incorporated, their ESG into, or are incorporating ESG into their processes, right, and into decision making around loans and so forth.
Thanks very much. Kais, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, I think, I mean, it's a journey of 1,000 steps. So I think there is no silver bullet. And I mentioned before how we had the trial and error process to get to plastic neutrality, and I think don't shy away from trying out things. So I think first of all, put really a team on it, put focus on it. I think really, ideally, people who understand business and the whole business implications. Then maybe as a next step, set very hairy goals, really scary goals, that you feel you can never achieve. It's impossible, just to get the momentum going. And then I think as you embark on that journey, you will discover that there are some low-hanging fruits, and then there are more difficult things that require more substantial change. But it helps you to get the visibility and then get going. I mean, I said we want to be net zero carbon by 2050. Please don't think that we have it all worked out. We don't know. It's still a long way to go, but many things we don't know how we're going to get there. But there are a number of things we know already that we could do them, and we're already doing them. So I think just get going, create the momentum, and then you'll be surprised.
Thanks very much, Kais. And Paul, thanks for the question.
Yes. Thank you, Coco.
Thanks. Mark, we might have time to go back later on to your points about that Kais was touching on, about being bold and taking big steps as well. But right now, I'd like to go to a question or a comment from Andrew Escaler from Pasudeco. Andrew, Pasudeco is Pampanga Sugar, right? Andrew? Is Andrew still with us?
Oh.
Hi, Andrew, are you there? Is Andrew there?
Hi, Coco. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You had a question or more of a comment?
Coco, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Hello?
Hello.
Andrew, can you hear us? Okay,
Sorry, my internet's really bad today.
You're coming in very clear.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the comment was just I feel like the government should do a better job having companies reflect what prices truly are. Because right now, people like Kyle are subsidizing our lifestyle today with a pretty bleak future tomorrow, I think. So I think that's one of these externalities that need to be addressed.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Mark, you talked about Southeast Asia not necessarily being a beacon when it comes to regulation. Could you tell us either where the big gaps are, or what begins to move regulation in the countries where that's more advanced? And maybe after that, I'll turn to Kais, because he's been all over, both I guess Australia and Africa and other places. But Mark first.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's also a sort of SDG by SDG, I think, question in some ways, right? But let me just talk about three one I would say, which we typically see originally, I think born out of necessity, but actually, people do it out of the good of the of the company, is supporting local communities, right? Often, people, factories, mine sites, I don't know, oil and gas production, we're quite remote, and you have to basically supply a workforce there, get them educated and so forth. So I think, if we look at that, that's actually something I would say that across Southeast Asia, not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's necessarily government incentive, but, I think it was at least a supportive environment to do so, right? But I think where the challenge for me at the moment lies is, and it's easy, I guess, to say, and I'm always very conscious, as not being a Southeast Asian, even though I've lived here for 17 years, to point the finger at the governments here. Because I do think, going back to my comment earlier around just transition, is that we are facing quite a complex set of challenges in trying to address the future on climate change, for example. And it's not easy, right? Because companies will need to balance economic growth, providing education and so forth, with climate action. If you look at sort of the intensity of the economies in terms of carbon per GDP, some countries here are actually quite high because we have quite carbon intensive industries, particularly when you count into Afulu or the agri sector into this. So what to do there, right? It's not easy. So I don't necessarily fault them for not having a plan in place. What I would say is, for me, it's a whole of society type of engagement, right? Which it's like state-owned sector, it's government, it's private sector. And I actually think the private sector in the Philippines, from all I can see, is actually being quite active in sort of driving this forward, right? So I wouldn't also rely on governments here. So I was at a forum actually just before the pandemic hit, and it was a question, it was around, what do you believe will drive action in climate, right? And so will it be the government, will it be the consumer, will it be companies, right? And the governments were the ones who got the lowest score, right, of all the participants. But it just puts the pressure back on consumers and private companies or corporates in general. And maybe the last comment just on it. So that's on the climate side, because it's typically there's a socioeconomic component which is quite difficult to resolve. I think for example, on the waste side, it's easy to say we need to recycle more, but like as Kai's highlighted, I mean, there's basically no infrastructure in place to do this, right? And so building that up, and I'm not talking about just like recycling plants and so forth, but like the whole logistics of it and so forth are actually quite difficult, right? And then there comes things like, when I think Kai, you mentioned this, right? The COVID situation has maybe actually exacerbated some of these issues. I mean, I see this also here in Singapore. I mean, like, so many people do home delivery the whole time. You just have much more plastic going at home. But now also companies like the Deliveroos and Grabs and so forth, they see that this can become a potential issue for them, right? I mean, and if governments start saying, hey, hold on a second, you're creating a problem here, then what their business, is in jeopardy, right? And some companies have addressed this, like in small scale, for example, Nespresso. They make sure, like, when you get your new capsules delivered at home, they take your old capsules back, right? And as a little give back, every couple of months, you get like 2 coasters made of recycled aluminium, right? So I mean, there's small things, so just examples, right? But like getting that sort of circularity infrastructure in place is hard and requires regulation, but also requires a lot of investment, requires good governance, right? So sorry, a lot of challenges, not maybe solutions, but I think, but it is complex and difficult. So I think my call for action is always corporates and consumers ultimately, need to drive it. And for the consumers, it's the one that can. I mean, I saw some of the comments in the chat. People can barely, survive. Like, how can we ask them to pay premium? I mean, yes, of course, right? But there is a segment of the market that can. And they should be helping drive this and supporting this.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'll still have one more question to you before we end. It might be a bit related to this actually, but before we begin to close, Kais, could I ask you to comment on some of these points that were raised here, whether it's regulation versus corporate, and maybe if you could put it through the lens of where you've worked around the world. I assume Oceania includes Australia, relatively developed, and you've been to Africa as well, Europe, and here, Kais.
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, I will just answer that and then log out because I have another meeting. But just to build on that, look, I think at the end, the role of government is to create obviously a legislative framework, like has been done with ERP bill now, but I think also to really help create a circular economy that really, let the market forces solve the problem by itself. So I think, for example, we have more or less the same population as Japan. I think Japan consumes more plastic, but Japan's plastic doesn't end up in the ocean like our plastic, right? So because there's a whole system of collecting, and the same in Australia or Germany or other countries where you collect and segregate plastic or trash at home, and then it gets really sorted out and taken then into different chains that really then take care of the materials. And then there's a certain degree of recycling, but for sure these materials don't end up in oceans or very little in landfill. So I think really creating that circular economy. Here in the Philippines, you have the palenques, right, who collect some garbage. But why do palenques collect the plastic bottles? Because the plastic bottles have a value. Somebody is happy to buy them back. But when it comes to our plastic laminates, all the soft flexible plastics, nobody's collecting that, even if they're on the floor, because they have no value. So how can we create a value around that? How can government help create an industry of recycling packaging? Because the moment you set up an industry that recycles packaging, then for sure people will find value in collecting it and bringing it to the factory to get something in exchange for it. And industry will happily buy also recycled plastic. Why wouldn't we? But I think there's still a few scientifically technological hurdles to overcome to make that easy and accessible without high investment. I think the role of government is really to help set this up as well, with financing, with a legislative framework, so that the whole system can start running on its own.
Guys, thank you very much for everything you've done today. I know you have to leave, so we'll thank you and say goodbye. I ask the others to stay as well.
Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Coco. Thank you.
So again, thanks to Kais and thanks to Mark, and thank you to all the participants for today's engaging discussion. Before we ask the last question, could we invite all of you to share with us your comments and feedback on today's activity? Please scan the QR code that we're flashing on your screen right now, or you may click on the link that one of my colleagues is sharing in the chat box. Please note that we may use your comments in our publications. While everyone's answering that feedback form, I'd like to ask one final question of Mark, and it comes from Dana Uson from Ayala again. Mark, how have you seen companies in other emerging markets pivot to more sustainable practices when alternatives to cleaner raw materials are not readily available? For example, steel and cement. Choosing to source these abroad would have its own additional carbon footprint and would therefore lead to more expensive end products. So I'm not sure if this is a logistics chain or a supply chain issue, but if they can't find the sustainable materials here and to get it abroad, doesn't that create more issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good question. So I fully agree with the sentiment that maybe sourcing it abroad is not necessarily the answer, right? Because again, if you take a holistic approach to this, you're basically creating other issues in country potentially, right, as well. So now a couple of thoughts there maybe. One is, so there's a short-term and long-term answer. So if we're talking about carbon or CO2, then the long-term answer would be working with people that are currently your suppliers and seeing how you could work with them to develop their carbon footprint down, right? So if you're, for example, buying steel from a company with an electric arc furnace, so you ask them basically around like what are their plans? Is there anything we can support with, to either move to some renewable energy or to, increase energy efficiency or whatever the answer may be. But some of these take time, but I think it's engaging the suppliers in this example on trying to develop them into the right direction. The short-term maybe answer to that is doing other things that basically compensate for that carbon footprint, right? So, depending, if you're doing this from a perspective of having agreed to certain climate targets that are under, a certain framework, you can maybe use offsets and actively engage in those. You could even actively engage in the development of offsets as well, so that you have direct access to them. So that's then a sort of a compensating, maybe short to midterm option while you're sort of developing a more sustainable supplier base. But I agree, the going out is not is maybe a simple answer, but it's not the sustainable answer really, in like sustainable answer, if I can call it that way.
Could I could I ask you one final question, Mark? And it's those 2 points you raised in one of your earlier slides about being bold and taking big steps. With all of these other pressures, P&L, of course, the major one among them. How can one afford to be bold about things that may not pay off quickly? I'm thinking about Kais. He's been here since 2018. I'm not sure how long a Nestle CEO's term is. The decisions he makes here, I'm not sure if it will show up in his evaluation report 3 years from now, sure, when he's heading another market, for example. So how can businesses and executives afford to take bold and big steps when the returns are so unclear or far down the road? And that would be my final question, Mark.
It's a good question, and I guess, again, I don't want to put everybody in the same bucket, right? So I understand that some companies have other sort of shorter term challenges, and not even talking about that the initiatives may not actually provide returns, but just having sufficient funds to finance and invest in those initiatives may not be there, right? So and then obviously the question is there other ways of accessing capital, for example, but I'll leave that aside for now. I really want to make sure that, and maybe I didn't spend enough time on it, but the slide I presented, which showed that companies typically think about the SDGs and this as a constraint to their business versus as an opportunity to their business. So there's something really in here, I think, about mindset change. Not everything will, this is not a cost to the business. Yes, some things are. I'm not saying there's no cost to the business, but what we're saying is that there are a lot of things that actually will generate value, and the value may not come out of the initiative directly, but creates value either later in the value chain. I talked about the valuation premiums. I mean, your multiples increase, right? Your share price increase, right? That's what that means. Now, depending on what you are measured against, that's a really tangible outcome in that. So I think, beyond the constraints there, and more broadly, and happy to engage post talk in further conversations. I think if I can make one more statement just to your MNC point. So I think that's true, obviously, and I think all of us, have short-term and longer-term KPIs. You have an opportunity, I think, in the Philippines, a very strong sort of family-owned part of the economy where people think more generationally, right? If you drive the market, the MNCs that are operating in your market will need to follow, right, beyond the term of any single CEO side, right, if they want to compete. So, I'll kind of pass the ball back to the participants there to pick that up and think about that, right? Because I think you do have, like some of the companies, at least, do have some different incentive structures.
Mark, thanks very much, and thanks for ending on that note about family companies and their more generational outlook on this. And if anyone here needs to or wants to get in touch with BCG, you can certainly message Mark now or ask us, and we'll put you in touch. We'll put you in touch with them. On that note, Mark, thank you very much. Thanks very much to BCG for this series. I'll be talking in a bit about the other two sessions. Thank you to our media partner, Business Mirror. And thank you to all the members and guests for attending today's session. We really appreciate your presence today and the questions you've asked as well. It was a very good conversation. Thank you very much. We'd like to invite everybody to our upcoming activities. The next session of this sustainability series with BCG is on March the 16th. BCG's Southeast Asia Managing Director, Dave Sivaprasad, and RCBC President and CEO Eugene Acevedo will lead the discussion on changed management for sustained impact. Next, we're also going to invite you to the second session of another series. This is the Business Online series at Foodpanda PH. That's on Feb 23. Shopee Philippines Director Martin Yu will keynote that discussion on supporting MSMEs in e-commerce. To register for these, please visit our website, www.mbc.com.ph/events, or you can click on the link provided by my colleague in the chat box. Also, please follow us on facebook.com /Makati Business Club, one word, Makati Business Club. Thank you and good day to all of you. We look forward to seeing you again in our future events. Thank you and stay safe. Mark, thank you very much, and to the rest of the BCG team. Everybody else, thank you and have a good day. Have a good lunch, everyone.
Thank you, Coco.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.